the Bloviating Zeppelin's Berserk Bobcat Saloon. Every good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. This one is no different. Imagine a tall field of sweet grass blowing in the wind. The stalks are bobbing and moving, over 3 feet tall. There you are, a child looking up at the grass, the blue sky, the summer heat, warming you. You're young, you're free, you're innocent. You can be a child. Those were the days when your parents were to be feared, respected. Your friends made pinky swears. You had a 6 o'clock curfew, and the girl you liked gave you an actual Valentine, cheap as it was. You rode without seatbelts. Dashboards were metal. Bicycles were fat and heavy and slow. Typewriters clacked when you used them. Televisions were only announced in color on Quinn Martin production shows. Phones had rotary dials. And your grandmother smelled of flower and roses and cooked only lamb with real butter and city water. It smelled, but it was city water after all. Your parents would leave you with your grandparents, but you didn't mind. You had the backyard swing and the massive fig tree to climb. You could always investigate the second-floor kitchen and Grandpa's dark shed, festooned with tools. Dark shapes, dark ominous tools, the deep smell of musky wood. Did you touch them? Did you dare? You didn't. Grandma would take you to the store. She'd head you across the city street next to a neighbor's house through the back gate and access to an alley that no one else had. It was truly mystical. A gate that no one else used. While she shopped, you'd cast your gaze about the 5 and dime looking for plastic soldiers or bags of aliens or plastic biplanes with which to wage bright-colored dives. And then you went back. As a small child, you'd run the scooty car up and down the sidewalk in front of the grandparents' house. Enthralled, absolutely enthralled by the length of the block and concerned when you got too far from their house. You got worried. There were cracks in the pavement, but you didn't die. What do you remember about Grandma's house? You remember its darkness, its shadows, its wood, its huge ceilings, the dark furniture downstairs, the light wood furniture upstairs. You remember staying there when Mom and Dad went away. Hell, I even remember my grandparents' phone number. They had a heavy and black rotary dial phone with its thick cloth cord. The number was GL55483, and that back then meant Gladstone. 55483. My home number, also with its rotary dial, was IV95253. That meant Ivanhoe 95253. Do you remember any of this? When you were old enough and the phone rang and you had to answer, Zeppelin residence. Sometimes I still call that number to see if my dad answers. Of course he doesn't. Why do I do this even now? I would remember that my parents would take me to Grandma's house every year to watch Wizard of Oz with my mother, my father, my brothers, grandparents, Aunt Me and Uncle Bill and Cousin Sue and Don all sitting together in the living room, 10 of us at least, believing the movie was black and white for years, watching the world of Disney, having Thanksgiving downtown, while the adults sat at the adult table. Kids sat at the folding kids table. Christmas was transcendent. You never experienced Christmas as you did then. Before or later, it meant something else entirely. Innocence. What do you remember about Christmas as a child? The Christmas tree somehow magically appeared by way of Dad set into its metal legs. Water poured into the round base with screws to be set in the tree just above the cut. I'd always help Mom decorate the tree because that's just what I did. I'd help. Handed the delicate glass ornaments. They were all glass back then. Damn us if we ate them. Removed them carefully from the prepackaged boxes over the years and attached the looping hooks. You had to affix them to the tree one by one. I'd help place the lights as well. They had huge thick cords back then, steady bright bulbs. You'd suckle them around the tree, and then came the fresh tinsel. Purchased in rectangular boxes made of that heavy and reflective. And if you remember back then, this stuff was lead, actual lead. By the Bright Star Company, it was promoted as icicles. I'd drape it around the tree under the gaze of my mother, and you had to be very careful because you didn't apply it too much. You had to spread it around. That was extremely important. You didn't lump it at one place. Today, these boxes are labeled caution. This is an old-fashioned lead tinsel made in the 1950s or earlier, before the dangers of lead came to light. The tinsel should not be used in homes with children or animals. Well then, what was I? Was I child or animal? Guess what? It was, however, used in homes with children and animals, and quite evidently I'm still here. When the adults were in the living room at night, they were occupied. Did you ever sneak into the den at Christmas in the dark with only the Christmas trees illuminated? You know, to shake the presents? You try to suss out each box and its contents. Just sit down adjacent the gas heater in your jammies in order to smell the pine tree and watch the lights. Was it just magical? Or what? What would you give to be there again? And what were your earliest memories? You remember anything as a child? How young you were? How old you were? I remember this. I remember being in a playpen in the den. How the hell old are you when you're in a playpen? I remember having some kind of stuffed monkey and ripping its head off. I guess I was maybe, 3 years old or 2? I don't know. I just have the memory. My father worked for the Air Force and he was seldom home. Mom was simultaneously tasked with raising me as the youngest child, and my 2 brothers as the eldest children, 10 years between me and my 2 brothers. It was a difficult time, no doubt, but my mother, in reflection, I think she might have been just a bit overwhelmed. She was the lone female in a predominantly male household, and she had to make a name for herself. Dad was mostly gone. She was always there. She would threaten with my dad's wrath, but the only wrath I ever felt was at her hand, several times, to the point where the breath was literally beaten out of me on 3 separate occasions. But because children are so remarkably flexible, forgiving, it wasn't literally until decades later that I realized what had occurred. In 2002, I declined to speak at her funeral. I never stopped being aware of my surroundings after that. People could hurt you. Even people you loved, people close to you. I learned a very valuable lesson. Dirt-clad walls behind the backyard, Matt Ryan in the goat cart, the TNT circus, tadpoles in the creek behind the house, my best friend catching tadpoles in a jar, Tonka trucks, matchbox cars, dinky cars, corgi cars, going to Bob's Toyland in the village and paying a whopping $1.02, including tax, for the Aurora Plastic Model Series kits of Universal's Frankenstein, the Mummy, the Creature, the Wolfman, Dracula. I had to save up a long time for those, because I actually got an allowance. In the meantime, your bicycle was your magical conveyance. When I was old enough, my father insisted that I ride over the backyard grass on training wheels. It was difficult, but I did it because he told me to, and then, next time, no training wheels. I fell down only once. It was in the grass. I didn't have a helmet. It didn't hurt. I didn't die. I didn't break a bone. I discovered I could ride a bicycle. Then the world was my oyster. And from that, awareness came. Now, I was an Air Force brat. I grew up recognizing airplanes. We lived under the approach pattern for McClellan Air Force Base, adjacent the perfectly aligned north-south Fulton Avenue, and I was able to identify Lockheed RC-121 Constellation radar picket planes, Fairchild C-119 flying boxcars, Douglas C-124 Globemasters, a myriad of Boeing B-47 bombers, as well as listening to the regular engine stand tests at McClellan of the jet engines and the occasional massive rocket engine tests at Aerojet. That was probably 15 miles away. Those were the engines that they were testing for the space program in Aerojet. They may have even lit off a Saturn V back then. 15 miles away, they sounded like they were next block away. Now, a few miles away at Mather Air Force Base, the SAC 320th Bombardment Wing flew B-52s from the Zulu ramp where the 904th Air Refueling Squadron flew its KC-135 Stratotankers in support. All these numbers. Yeah, that's how much of an Air Force brat I was. Knew it all. Funny thing was, Mather Air Force Base, that was, oddly enough, the base where my dad met my mom. Dad was born in Minneapolis. He claimed the native state of Texas. He joined World War II a little later in the fight, and it was determined by the stellar U.S. Army Air Corps that he was going to be bomber material, not fighter material. His aptitude revolved around teams and not independence, as that's what you want in a fighter pilot. So they made him a B-17G pilot, where eventually he went to the 8th Air Force out of England. Except for the fact that he survived all his missions, he was crushed. I can remember him telling me that. He was crushed that he was only a bomber pilot. He said he once flew a B-17 that had, "Is this trip really necessary?" on its nose. Every pilot wanted to be a fighter pilot. Some hauled trash, some flew bombers. If you flew goods, freight, etc., you were considered a trash hauler. Dad flew his missions. He was one lucky son of a bitch, and then he was sent back across the pond to the U.S. But of course, the U.S. Army Air Corps intervened once again. Having flown B-17s, the wisdom of the administration ruled that Dad would become an instructor pilot in not B-17s, but in the North American B-25 light bomber, the Mitchell, from Mather Air Force Base. 10,000 B-25s were built in World War II. Think about that. How many B-2 Spirit bombers have been built to date right now? 21. From there, my father not only met Jimmy Doolittle, he later met Jimmy Stewart, with whom he knocked down a few drinks at a local bar while assigned to Mather. Eventually, my dad was a lieutenant colonel, and then he made full bird colonel. It was at that point that he was transferred to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. We went with him. We had no choice. We occupied on-base housing in one of the most wonderful homes I'd ever experienced. In truth, my mother was the disciplinarian, my father was the unknown quotient. My mother was from Sacramento. She lived in a large two-story house built in the late 1800s. That house is still there. Mom told me that her parents had a choice of addresses, and for her convenience, they chose a particular address. Grandpa owned a large parcel of land from his original house all the way over to what later became the California DMV building off of Broadway. That's a lot of land. Mom said they had horses in the backyard at one time. And further, that Grandma never learned to drive, neither did Grandpa. By the way, there was no driveway at the house. I never clued into that fact for years and years. Grandma took care of the house and the kids. Grandpa worked for Newbert's Hardware downtown. So, they consisted of my mother and her brother Bill. And that's the house that I'd go to when my parents went on vacations. My grandparents' house. My brothers went on to college and I was the last at home. We moved to Ohio when Dad got transferred there. For years and years and years, he'd gone on all sorts of trips. He frequently went to the Pentagon. He also went to various bases in Texas, a lot of them in Georgia. It wasn't until his last days that I learned he'd been assigned to Roswell, New Mexico, in 1947. And it wasn't until just before he passed that I began to assemble pieces of Roswell, the Pentagon, and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Living on base was surreal. My dad was an Air Force colonel surrounded by generals. It wasn't natural for mere colonels to acquire the best on-base housing, but it was customary to have general after general after general over to the house for dinner. Ours was that it was a gorgeous, beautiful two-story brick building at 444 E Street. Even to this day, I remember that address. Because you're in Ohio, it had a basement. It had a fire-breathing oil-fired heater and a soft water tank because the water was hard as hell. I learned to rebuild my Yamaha DT125 Enduro there. While on base, I was able to experience things no one else did. I can distinctly remember parking my first car at the east end of the runway at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, lying on the hood, my back up on the windshield, and just relaxing as the B-52s would approach for landing. They'd come right over my head like the opening scene in the first Star Wars movie. Their foul black engine exhaust wash over me, and I'd just be exhilarated. I could smell it. The noise was absolutely surreal. You could see the Stratofortresses coming in, crabbing for their landings, their gear able to physically adjust for crosswinds. I brought my first girlfriend ever, Dawn, there one time. We both watched the planes land. It was that exciting. Other times, I'd head west on Wright-Pat as I watched the B-52s line up for takeoff, but they were only about 100 feet or so away from me. And they went down, taxied hard right. Some of the pilots would actually salute me as I watched. Not till years later did I realize what an honor that was, because young people are intrinsically stupid. The United States Air Force Museum was also at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It was very young, just beginning, and I started to frequent it so much during the day that the employees started to let me wander around in the Air Force Museum after closing for a few minutes. Shortly after it arrived, I was able to sit in the cockpit of the last surviving XB-70 Valkyrie. I can remember the number. I remember the number to this day, 62-001. Even back then, when I was thin and lithe and whatnot, I can recall the difficulty I had getting into the pilot's seat. The seat cushion was orange, the round dial in the center of the pilot's yoke was bright yellow, and surrounding the pilot and the co-pilot were these clamshell doors. They were part of the escape ejection capsule. You basically couldn't see shite at the front windows, and I wondered, how the hell did the pilots land this damn thing when they were perched 25 feet above the ground and a good 40 feet ahead of the nose wheel? Only later did it finally dawn on me what an honor it was to be given the access I had to the museum. Somebody there must have liked me. I never found out who, and I can't imagine why. At the same time, I was starting my love affair with motorcycles. My first encounter was with a Honda Mini Trail 50, then the Honda 70, and a Honda 90 with a tank conversion kit courtesy of Terrell Allen. From there, the aforementioned Yamaha 125 and on to a 1980 Yamaha XS11. An absolutely beautiful 1983 BMW R100RT and a 1984 Honda Magna V65. This is amusing. I would later purchase a 1997 Suzuki DR650 SE Thumper. That means it's a single cylinder. They only came in hideous colors. Where I promptly attempted to kill myself by taking on a steep hill in the wrong gear. I got about halfway up of that sucker, grabbed a handful of clutch, and by then I was out of proper gears, so I stood transfixed, having stopped perpendicular to the hill, and I realized there's only two ways out now. Just drop the damn bike and watch it spin and cartwheel a few hundred feet down below, or I could somehow get back on it and ride it down like some kind of a crazy sled. Well, I think you know what I decided. So, about 2 minutes later, after I woke up, I realized there was a large, unanticipated tree across my path, which had sent me flying over the handlebars and into a pile of gravel riprap next to the trickle of water adjacent to the railroad right-of-way. And I finally realized I woke up because the water was so damn cold. It was in my helmet. That was the second time I can remember losing consciousness, not of my own doing, and I think you know what the first one was. Then there was college. Don't forget, I was a child of the 60s. The Summer of Love wasn't just a slogan. For a time, I actually lived in Haight-Ashbury. I was a well, this is where this comes from. I was a registered Democrat. And at the time, the SLA, Eldridge Cleaver, Weather Underground, the SDS, I knew all about them. Abby Hoffman wrote Steal This Book. I stole it. And that was when I got into radio. My first exposure to radio was at a college radio station back east. The local carrier current station, located in the basement next to the Rathskeller Beer Pub, had a window to the hallway. Its door was open. So I'm walking down this hallway, and I peek in, and there's Tommy Purcell wearing his trademark British driving cap, and he yells at me, "I'm late for class, get in here." I have no idea who the hell this guy is, or why he's late for class, and why it involves me. So he comes out to the hallway, grabs my books, throws them into the chair in the control room, sits me down at the console, showed me how to cue up a record, which switch to throw for the mic and the turntables, how to turn up the pots, and then he ditches me and goes to class. We didn't even have cart decks then. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, that's how I got my first ever shift in radio. So, from there I met a grand bunch of leftist reprobates who introduced me to potato water from Mother Russia. And from there, I was hooked, perhaps in any number of ways. And while in Ohio, I worked for 3 radio stations. Now, at the time, if you wanted music, they were on records. I didn't buy too many 45s. All of them that I purchased were 33s, and I got them from the place called The Forest in Dayton, Ohio, with a guy named Carl Kimball, who was my music mentor back then. From him, I learned of King Crimson, Frank Zappa, Pink Floyd, John McLaughlin, Miles Davis, Cream, Blind Faith, Mahavishnu Orchestra, Gentle Giant, Modern Jazz Quartet, and so it goes. I read everything that Kurt Vonnegut ever wrote. I read Beowulf, Soul on Ice, 1984. I volunteered for George McGovern's campaign. Think on that for a while. When I went back to California, a friend got me hooked back into radio at KFBK. Did those call letters sound a little familiar to you? The 50,000 watt flamethrower, so I worked traffic, FM programming, morning drive, PM drive, news editing, everything except I didn't have my own on-air shift. I was not major on-air talent. I got my third-class broadcast license at KFBK. If you wanted to sit in the announce booth, you had to actually have your first-class license, and it was a bastard to get. And you also had to have someone sponsor you into the IBEW. That's the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. That was my little turd in the punch bowl. In the meantime, I worked for 6 other local and not-so-local radio stations, because if you were in radio, that's what you did back then. You worked for every damn radio station you could. You took every damn shift you could. Night, day, it didn't matter. The money was crap. You just wanted to be on the air. So because of my sound work with various radio stations, I was given the opportunity to actually help record the Status Quo live album in Glasgow, Scotland. I later met Bon Scott, the first singer for AC/DC, and then Geezer Butler, who's the bass player for Black Sabbath, as well as some of the other persons in Gentle Giant. Absolutely stellar times that we did other things, perhaps, maybe, with then. Also, as Bernie, the security guard at McClatchy, let me into the building for a time after I was sort of let go, I was able to meet not only Morton Downey Jr. at KFBK, but a little round fuzzball who'd had a meeting with the station manager and possessed a strange name. For fuck's sake, who names that kid Rush? Here's the catch, though. While at KFBK, I had occasion to run the editing desk and I checked through all the PSAs submitted by various organizations. Now, PSA is a public service announcement, and every radio station, according to the FCC, has to run a certain amount of PSAs, public service announcements, every week. Because it's a mandate, they always run them at night or on the weekends. So my job at the time was to go through the PSAs and decide which ones were pivotal, were important. So one day I came across a PSA advertising for reserve law enforcement officers for the local department. So this is sort of a pivotal moment for me. I'm sure you've had your all. For me, this was mine. Because when I drove by the parents' house, I told them of my plan. I was going to become a reserve deputy sheriff. Oh boy. And my mother said, "You can't do that. That's not you. You don't have it in you." Really? Well, that was my first thought. I don't have it in me, eh? All right. Good enough. We'll be back after this.
SHR Media Network.
Breaking news. According to the latest report coming out of SHR Media, a merchandise store to support both the Reaver of Common Sense and SHR Media has just been unleashed to the general public. Be forewarned that this site can be contagious and numerous items can be purchased to support the best news programming. Go to Reaver.one website and click on the store link to check out the merchandise.
Hello, I'm Matt, a student at Hillsdale College. Here's Hillsdale President Larry Arnn on the continuing relevance of the Constitution.
Many argue today that the Constitution is outdated because it addresses problems peculiar to the 18th century. Some parts of the Constitution do read rather quaintly. Consider the injunction against titles of nobility in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. But is that so outdated? The purpose of the injunction is to prevent the government granting special privileges to some for partisan reasons. This strikes at the heart of the rule of law. The crony capitalism so common today is a place where the government bestows favors and tax dollars on some businesses to give them a leg up over others. This is exactly the kind of thing the Constitution was meant to prohibit. The Constitution is not so outdated after all.
This Constitution Minute was brought to you by Hillsdale College. To join the national conversation on the Constitution, go to constitutionminute.com.
Times are dark. The people misled by corrupt politicians, lied to by establishment media, and deceived by the false messages of Islam. A nation in confusion needs a guide. It needs a man with a cane. I'm Dave Milner. Join me on Spreaker, SHR Media, High Plains Talk Radio, Live Rebooting Liberty, and YouTube for a unique brand of commentary on the unpleasant blind guide. Because truth is not always pleasant.
In a world controlled by corrupt politicians.
You got a business. You didn't build that.
A team of ordinary men emerge from the ashes to give voice to the voiceless and hope to the hopeless. Sackhead Sean.
Dude, I'm not saying Cap was stupid, bro.
Sackhead Clint.
All good friends of ours usually show up drunk.
Also starring Sacco as the producer.
I'm a little bit drunk, 'cause I'm drinking.
They are the Sackheads Radio Show. Every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Pacific on SHRmedia.com.
Beware, the Jersey Takeover is here. Every Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can catch the Reaver of Common Sense Show, hosted by Jersey Joe, right here on SHRmedia.com and HighPlainsDailyNews.com. Only Jersey can deliver hell like no one else. so consider this your fair warning.
Conservative media done right. You're listening to the SHR Media Network.
And we're back. I don't have it in me. I'll never forget those words. The gauntlet was hurled and I picked it up, for better or worse. I didn't have it in me. Really. And from that stemmed my career and the rest of my life, to essentially prove my mother not only wrong, but egregiously wrong. So I was doing these things concurrently. I was working in radio for KFBK and for other commercial stations, 2 campus radio stations, 1 AM, KEG, 1 FM, KERS. I was photo editor for the university newspaper, taking classes, learning photography at night, and on alternative night and weekends, taking the basic course for California law enforcement officers. I had to pay for my books, my tuition, my car, the upkeep, the insurance, as well as, engaging liberally the various women with whom I consulted. College. Good times. I passed the academy. I entered law enforcement. The exact opposite of what certain people expected of me. 41 years later. I have to say, I'm never sorry for that moment. It was the proverbial game changer in my life. Whereas some persons are hesitant to sort of delineate or outwardly reveal a life in law enforcement these days because of the tempestuous times in which we're involved, I have nothing to hide now and nothing to lose. After all, I'm retired. I worked for the FBI. I was a sworn U.S. Marshal. I worked for a coastal law enforcement agency, and then I returned back to Sacramento. Let's just cut to the chase, shall we? I've been shot at 3 times, and I returned fire once. That was back in the 70s. Thank God, prior to the internet and the current loss of privacy, one cannot find my critical incident because it was not kept. I shall mostly leave it at that. One person lost their life, I kept mine. I sort of like it that way. I came back to the Sacramento Sheriff's Department in a full-time capacity in 1980. But because of that incident and the fact that the number of training academy hours demanded by post had increased since I last went into training, I had a choice. I could piecemeal my training or I could hit a full-time academy. So I chose the full-time academy, which, as it turned out, was located at the Central CHP Academy in Yolo County. Now, I was older than most of the other recruits. It just sort of worked out that way. And I had a wonderful time, and I really enjoyed training at CHP. But little did I know that I'd be going back there just a year later to train my officers in EVOC, that's the Emergency Vehicle Operations course, on their skills course. Skid pan, their pursuit course, and drive the high-speed track. Now, a little bit of an aside for reference. When I took the law enforcement test for the Sacramento Sheriff's Department, the competition in those days was, let's just say it was massive. The Sacramento Convention Center, which is an extremely large building with large rooms, was used to present the initial written test for recruits. There were 3 tests given that day in 3 shifts, and there were over 1,500 candidates testing for 10 spots in the Sheriff's Department and 20 spots for the Sacramento Police Department. After the written and the physical, I came out number 1 in the Sheriff's Department. I didn't realize how important that was going to become because Academy ranking determines your ultimate seniority over others later. And that was extremely important in terms of vacations, assignments, and shifts. And frankly, I have to admit, I was surprised the department took me back at all. I was tainted with a nasty stain, and the fact that my former department basically said I'd have to resign or be fired. I think I chose to resign. Imagine that. I can still recall my badge number. Of course, that's not to say that because I'm the Bloviating Zeppelin, I didn't do a few stupid things while I was there. Here's one. I opened my mouth in a DSA meeting when they were speaking about the installation of tachographs in automobiles, in cop cars. Now, a tachograph at the time was a really primitive instrument, a device that measures the speed, the acceleration, braking, lateral transfer of a vehicle being monitored. So, being a college graduate, young and studly and well-versed in stats, because I took the damn classes, I told people at the meeting that, stats can be massaged in many fashions, and because of the high number of accidents in the department, the stats are not going to go well for you, deputies. And the machines are going to be used for punishment and for discipline. I hope you guys realize that. Well, guess what? Unbeknownst to me, the sheriff of the entire department was also listening in the back of the room. Didn't see him. Along with my training lieutenant. Let's just say that did not endear me to the administration and tended to set a little bit of a shadow precedent that would follow me in my glorious career. I tend to speak the truth, whether it's politically correct or not. Clearly, it was sort of a fait accompli that my days were numbered in my first California law enforcement job, but my willingness to pull no punches and speak the truth was, it was my greatest asset and simultaneously my biggest weakness in terms of career. So I'd worked as a reserve deputy sheriff for my department in the formative early 70s when we had big cars with huge engines and radios with 5 channels. That's it. There were, in fact, no portable radios, no computers. When you left the car, you were on your own. If you needed assistance or cover on a call, you had to find somebody's landline. There were no call boxes to speak of. You either telephoned on a landline or somehow you had to make it back to your car. You had to wear your hat at all times outside the vehicle. You faced discipline if the sergeant caught you. I hated my hat, consequently. And, so to speak, skin cancer, here we come. On the other hand, my first cop car was a 1974 Dodge Monaco with a 440, just like the one in the Blues Brothers. You remember the line? It's got a cop motor, a 440 cubic inch plant, it's got cop tires, cop suspension, cop shocks. It's a model made before catalytic converters, so it'll run good on regular gas. What do you say? Is it the new Bluesmobile? Or what? Well, it was my car. My department also drove the Dodge, the Plymouth Satellite, the Fury. We had 2 years of the Pontiac Enforcer, the Le Mans, which was actually one of the best cars I've ever had the pleasure of driving. The Pontiac Le Mans, for reference, if you recall, the 1977 Pontiac Enforcer is the car driven by Sheriff Buford T. Justice, Jackie Gleason, in the film Smokey and the Bandit with Burt Reynolds. After that, we had 2 years of the Pontiac Catalina, and then 2 years of the worst ever car in law enforcement, and I mean ever, the Dodge St. Regis. And I called it the Dodge St. Slogus, and it stuck. That's what the department began calling it. See, those were the days back then of Rosebird, the Rosebird Supreme Court catalytic converters, downsized horsepower ratings, and for those not having lived through the times, the EPA actually mandated that there was an 85-mile-an-hour limit on your speedometer. Now, what that did, no one really knows. But the speedometers didn't go faster than 85. The car could go a lot faster than 85, but the speedometers didn't. The St. Slogus had a 318 engine. It was rated at 155 horsepower, on par with my 4-cylinder 2003 Subaru Outback Sport. This is a memory that will never escape. I was heading into watch in 1980, and I decided to floor my St. Regis on I-80 towards the Madison Avenue exit, because I was going to go to the North Station and to watch. I noted that on its certified speedometer, it reached a grand total of 79 miles an hour. I'm not kidding. Perhaps some people may now in the future think me some kind of law enforcement know-it-all, but my career has been long and it's been wide. And that's another obvious reason. I started in the jails. I went to patrol. When I was there, I became a reserve training officer, RTO. I made field training officer, FTO. I had a trainee in my car every day for my last year and a half in patrol. It was grinding. Only years later did I discover that what had happened is I'd been used by my then captain as the proverbial hatchet man for sinking trainees, because I had then no problem cutting a 10-page single-spaced daily evaluation for a troublesome trainee or a 30-page weekly evaluation for same. As one lieutenant, I remember, told me later, when I flushed a trainee, they stayed flushed. I really resented being used as a blunt tool for the department. Imagine this. It was depressing. Only getting failing trainees for my last year, and worse, not recognizing in what fashion I was being used. I thought that it was the most terrible of happenstance. Why did I get all these sinkers? Well, because it had been planned. I took the test for detectives just to get my sorry arse out at patrol. I hadn't ridden in a patrol vehicle for myself for almost 2 years. I passed the detectives test, coming out number 2 on the list, and I immediately went to the theft bureau in detectives. I worked alongside robbery detectives, but I was limited to theft cases back then. From there, I encountered my first active recruitment for other detective bureaus. I was asked to join the child abuse unit, which it turns out was, in fact, absolutely transformative. Now, in child abuse, back then, the new detectives received all the dead, burned, scalded, lacerated, smothered baby cases. The cases that no one in the unit wants. So you either made the cut taking those cases, or you left. It was a test. Did you have the fortitude to stick it out? Now, I never had kids, and I expect that's why I was sought. It wouldn't be quite so personal. Everybody wanted to go past those cases to the real, what we considered the real child abuse cases, the ones where you squared off in the interview room with the most devious, the most warped, the most intelligent, yet the most twisted minds in crime. The pederasts, the boy rapers, the sodomites, the felatists, those whose tastes were age-ranged and limited. If you don't want to hear the truth, you might want to turn off the radio right around now, because I soon discovered that male child abusers had tastes, and outside of those tastes, they weren't interested. There were those who lived to abuse infants and toddlers, literally infants and toddlers. There were those whose tastes were, say, 2 to 5. Some had tastes 5 to 7, 7 to 10, ranges 10 to 14. Now, once a child exceeded those age ranges, they were no longer interested, and they cast their victims aside for proper fresh ones. In the meantime, those adults who'd done their level best to use their adult brains and imaginations to absolutely oppress and mentally crush unequipped infant or juvenile minds and bodies. They groomed and coddled and petted their victims in any way necessary to satisfy their urges and fantasies. That was the most reprehensible aspect of it all. The mental assault. Sometimes, like now, I simply lack the words. Along the way, they'd insinuate themselves into a family unit, or already there, they did their best to ensure their victims would speak to no one about the depredations. They would mind-fuck their victims using guilt to suppress. Oh, Hector, you wouldn't want to see Uncle Lewis go to jail, would you? Well, this has to be our own little secret. Then I found someone. The bravest person I ever saw was not an adult, but a juvenile, a young girl named Marjorie. She was 14 at the time. In the presence of her mother, I had to make pretext telephone calls to her abuser. I fed her 3x5 cards live as she talked to him. He had abused her for years. Numerous counts of sexual abuse. I fed her cards with questions, and she took them and asked him over the telephone. He first made admissions, then he made confessions. Because of that one phone call, I was able to ship a case to the then brand new Vertical Prosecution DA's unit, later called SACA, Special Assault and Child Abuse, for a warrant. The suspect was sentenced to a large number of years in one of California's finest prisons. As you likely know, there's a hierarchy in the criminal world. Child abusers are the bottom of the food chain, and because even as criminals know, their own children can be victims. Marjorie took those cards and she worked them. She worked her abuser. Her voice, her demeanor, her terror, her tenor sold the story as well as any actor with an Academy Award. She was convincing, believable, credible, mature. She was wise beyond her years. Frankly, I didn't put away her abuser. She put him away. Sometimes I wonder where she is now, what she's doing. I only hope that she found the ability to move on and just take life by the horns. God bless you, Marjorie, wherever you might be. Somewhat simultaneously, as an aside, I began to work with a website called Absolute Zero United. It was an anti-pedophile site administered by good persons whose job was to expose the evil that men do. As a result of my writings there, I and a lot of other people on that site were sued for defamation. My personal information was displayed on the internet, including my address and phone numbers. Now, the site is still up. It hasn't been active since 2013, but if you have the stomach, if you have the time, go to absolutezerounited.blogspot.com and read not only my posts, but a lot of the posts in general. Trust me, I tell you, you'll need a strong constitution. But I highly recommend that you read some of the posts, if for no other reason than to understand the true nature of evil, how rampant it is, how invasive it is, how crafted it is, how corruptive. Then when you do that, you might be able to understand my background and my fight against NAMBLA and others and the astounding negative forces that are aligned every day against children and infants. You know, you can wish it away. You can ignore it. You can pretend it doesn't exist, but it does. I faced evil throughout my career in all of my assignments because I took an oath to be a sheepdog. I was a sheepdog then, and I'm still a sheepdog after retirement. Evil exists. I've seen it. I've experienced it. I know what it says, how it walks, what its breath smells like, what it looks like from afar. So from child abuse, I next moved over to the warrant fugitive detail. This was back when it was the elite of the elite. Well, then and now. Cops these days wouldn't do a fraction of the things that we did without a SWAT team back then. Our job in warrants was simple and direct. We had a box of warrants updated daily. We went out to do nothing but arrest persons on warrants. We didn't do misdemeanors. All of our warrants were felonies. We were divided into 4 teams of 2. We spread all the way throughout the county of Sacramento, including the city of Sacramento. We served warrants everywhere. It was customary to have a single 2-man team per felony warrant, one person up front to make contact and the second to cover, back exits. Every person in warrants at the time was from SWAT except me. If you thought, though, back then, that you were going to encounter either guns or a major league felon, you'd call for backup. But you didn't call for patrol backup unless it was absolutely heinous. You called for one of the other warrant teams to show up, and they did. Those were the days when cell phones were first coming into the mainstream. And each team was issued one large white Motorola Dynatac cell phone. It was a brick, the old white Motorola brick with a little rubber antenna at the top. We would think we were so damn clever and shitting in the tall cotton when we would call a suspect, tell him the cops were coming, have already set up on him in the house or the apartment, one deputy in front, one deputy in back, and then, of course, because the deputies are coming, the cops are coming, they'd step out and we'd catch them. God, we thought we were clever. So I went on extraditions. I served governor warrants. We were the unnoticed guys in the back of your plane carrying concealed firearms and monitoring felons in chains. That's how, for example, I met the members of the band Styx. They were flying, of all things, the flying coach, when one of them noticed us in the back with a rather unhappy-looking person sitting next to us, sort of a felon sandwich, if you will. One of the band members, I don't remember who it was, asked us who we were and what we were doing, and I told them. They didn't believe me, and they wanted to see my gun. I pulled my vest aside, and they all broke up laughing and shook our hands. All right, I guess it was funny then. Then after that, I worked for the Robbery Bureau. I worked for Sergeant Ron Howell. Sergeant Ron Howell also had supervision of the EOD unit, the Explosive Ordnance Detail. And I thought I wanted to get into EOD. I went for the training, I came back, and then I decided that it may not just be for me. Because I really didn't want to be called monopod at the time. And that makes me remember and think about a particular individual. You know, were you ever in your formative years when there was a particular person that was sort of your mentor? Well, there was an individual who was a major, major influence on me and had a massive influence on what I wanted to be and what I've subsequently become. The guy's name was Hugh Arthur McGraw. The people in patrol called him Baby Huey, but you never said that to his face. He died quite young, and it always makes me think to this day, why did he die? And I'm still here. And it's sort of time that I recognize him for what he was. He died at age 39. He had a Porsche 914. He loved that car. In 1979, he died of a cardiac arrest at the age of 39. What he'd do is he'd drive from one job to the other in the morning. He had at least 2 jobs, sometimes 3, plus the sheriff's department. And he worked almost continuously to support his kids, his ex-wife, his new wife, Polly, his job. He was 6'2", weighed 340 pounds. His wrist was probably 10 inches around. His hands were the size of catcher's mitts. His damaged hands were almost always covered by gloves, especially at work. That was his largest misperception. Most people thought he wore gloves because he thought himself a badass. In truth, he wore those black gloves because he was embarrassed by the scars on the palms and the backs of his hands because he was a welder. He was embarrassed for his working-class background, the fact that his hands and nails were the cracked, dirty, brown, scarred. Some people, yes, did call him Baby Huey. Like I said, never to his face. He was huge, make no mistake. He possessed power and strength. And like a lot of large people that I bet you know, he always reined in and harnessed his power. And he only unleashed it when he was prodded to do so. He drank Coke 24/7. 5 a.m., 5 p.m., it didn't matter. You always saw him with a Coke in his hand. And it wasn't until years later that I finally realized, well, he's trying to stay awake for his wife and his commitments because of all the jobs that he had. He was particularly sensitive when we went on calls with children, with animals, with women. I learned from him some planetary constants, though. I learned that there is actual good. And I learned that there is actual evil. I learned that evil prospers when good recedes. Nobody can allow evil to prosper. Only the ignorant or the foolish want to immediately die. Life is a fight. Nothing worthwhile is easy. You have to deal with facts and check your emotions at the door. He was huge, he was big, he was larger than life. One of the first times I ever worked with him, we were in Beat 14 that was Rancho Cordova at the time. It was really late at night, and because he'd worked all day and all night, he's sitting in the driver's seat. He started writing a report and he fell asleep. There's nothing going on the air. I was a reserve deputy at the time, and I'm sitting right next to him. I'm writing another report. So we're parked. I'm writing reports. He's snoring, and I felt this massive, overwhelming compulsion to just protect him. That's the kind of guy he was. So I resolved that was my job, protect him. So he showed me how to drive. He later made me drive everywhere. He showed me how to anticipate all the signs of the road, the curves, the corners. He trusted me as a reserve deputy to be contact officer on most of our calls, since I had some time behind me. He was tolerant, understanding of my mistakes. He never yelled. All he'd have to do is frown, and I know I'd recognize just by a frown, oh, I'm in some very, very serious shite. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll come back after this.
Done right. You're listening to the SHR Media Network.
Breaking news. According to the latest report coming out of SHR Media, a merchandise store to support both the Reaver of Common Sense and SHR Media has just been unleashed to the general public. Be forewarned that this site can be contagious and numerous items can be purchased to support the best news programming. Go to Reaver.one website and click on the store link to check out the merchandise.
Hello, I'm Matt, a student at Hillsdale College. Here is Hillsdale President Larry Arnn on the continuing relevance of the Constitution.
Many argue today that the Constitution is outdated because it addresses problems peculiar to the 18th century. Some parts of the Constitution do read rather quaintly. Consider the injunction against titles of nobility in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. But is that so outdated? The purpose of the injunction is to prevent the government granting special privileges to some for partisan reasons. This strikes at the heart of the rule of law. The crony capitalism so common today is a place where the government bestows favors and tax dollars on some businesses to give them a leg up over others. This is exactly the kind of thing the Constitution was meant to prohibit. The Constitution is not so outdated after all.
This Constitution Minute was brought to you by Hillsdale College. To join the national conversation on the Constitution, go to constitutionminute.com.
Times are dark. The people misled by corrupt politicians, lied to by establishment media, and deceived by the false messages of Islam. A nation in confusion needs a guide. It needs a man with a cane. I'm Dave Milner. Join me on Spreaker, SHR Media, High Plains Talk Radio, Live Rebooting Liberty, and YouTube for a unique brand of commentary on the unpleasant blind guide. Because truth is not always pleasant.
In a world controlled by corrupt politicians.
You got a business. You didn't build that.
A team of ordinary men emerge from the ashes to give voice to the voiceless and hope to the hopeless. Sackhead Sean.
Dude, I'm not saying Cap was stupid, bro.
Sackhead Clint.
All good friends of ours usually show up drunk.
Also starring Sacco as the producer.
I'm a little bit drunk, 'cause I'm drinking.
They are the Sackheads Radio Show. every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Pacific on SHRmedia.com.
Beware, the Jersey Takeover is here. Every Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can catch the Reverb Common Sense Show, hosted by Jersey Joe, right here on SHRmedia.com and HighPlainsDailyNews.com. Only Jersey can deliver hell like no one else, so consider this your fair warning.
Conservative media done right. You're listening to the SHR Media Network.
Hugh McGraw told me, always cover your partners, always cover your sergeant. Listen to the radio, know where everyone was, remember the last call. We didn't have any portables, we didn't have any laptops. All we had were ourselves to fall back on. I can remember my very first CPR call because eventually, sooner or later, you're going to do one. Now, we had no AEDs back then. All we had were just our hands and our mouths for CPR. 1977, I get a call. A small child has fallen into the parents' pool. So they called the sheriff's department. We responded, myself and Hugh McGraw. The body of the little boy lay in the deep end at the bottom. For those of you who may not know it, I hate water. I hate it. If fish shite in it, I don't want to be in it. I was the rookie, I was the new guy, so I dived in and pulled the child up. And I remembered my training, the strangest thing. The training kicked in. Have a flat surface. It has to be hard. It can't be a bed. Tilt the head. And the child died. Right there in my hands. The parents would not go into the pool and get him. I had to go into the pool and get him. Back then, I just assumed that's how it was. I figured I failed. I failed terribly. So that night after watch, I drank rather irresponsibly at the Cove. Then after that, I went next door to what we called the Standard Club, which was a standard gas station, where we'd go next door, get some more alcohol, and drink even more irresponsibly. And the next day, Hugh took me aside and scented me as best he could. I was still a little bit drunk. So I went to other various offices on the department. I became the best man at his wedding. And then after working so much, he passed away. He went from one welding job to another in the morning until the beginning of his swing shift. We worked swings back then, 1500 to 0100. He worked 2 or more jobs every day. His hands were scarred. He drove the car. He died doing what he considered to be normal, making money to keep his family afloat, to provide for his son and daughter from a prior marriage. His heart just succumbed to the stress. And yet, despite that, he had the largest heart I ever knew. So, Hugh, whatever meager manner of success I've managed to achieve in my career, quite frankly, I couldn't have done it without you. My friend, my hero. He perished at age 39. I've outlived him by 25 years. Who could see that? How? Why? You can't. From robbery, I went to homicide. I made that jump because basically back in robbery those days, your robbery suspects were basically the same as your homicide suspects. One of my greatest achievements, however, in robbery was this. I, at one point, had the largest sentence for a single individual in the state of California criminal history in 1994. I acquired a sentence of 884 years for a serial robber. That record stood for at least a year or two. I don't know, maybe more, maybe even now. I have no idea, but I was proud as hell about that back then. That's back when gangs were making the bloody marks on Sacramento streets. And when I was in robbery, it was nothing to have a monthly caseload. Just me, one person of 40 to 50 reports to investigate every month. That's just me. Now multiply that times 5 other robbery detectives per month. That's 200 cases of robbery per month in Sacramento County. Multiply that times 58 counties in the state of California back then. People were robbing and killing each other for shoes, for coats, for wearing the wrong color in various neighborhoods. BKs, very popular shoes, British Knights. They were labeled by the Crips as blood killers. Young kids back then died for wearing the wrong shoes. Asian families had their homes and apartments swarmed and robbed because young Asian males knew that Asian families distrusted banks and kept large amounts of cash on hand. All they had to do was travel around neighborhoods and look for the homes or the apartments with shoes outside. That's how you knew it was an Asian household. That's how you knew they'd have money inside. So I solicited for homicide. Homicide was a grind, an absolute grind. One of the best persons I'd ever seen in terms of interview and interrogation was Pat Flood. He left child abuse to go to homicide, but because it's such a grind, he eventually, for his family life, had to come back to child abuse and left homicide. Because at the time, you probably know it, it was nothing to work a homicide case non-stop for 24, 48, even 72 hours straight. I can recall that there was one particular homicide detective rolled 2 unmarked cars in 2 subsequent years because he fell asleep at the car going home after lengthy and intensive cases. He'd been literally awake for days. That's just what you did. I always loved training. I taught driver training for the feds at FLETC for TVOC on Range 9, my favorite, as well as CHP's site. I was instrumental in the acquisition of updating our driver training and worked with the best of what I considered to be Tom Doty, who has since passed away, and Mo Bailey. Back feature this. You're not going to... Well, yes, you're going to have to believe it because it's true. Back in the day, we would actually pour oil on the asphalt in order to simulate a skid pan. We weren't funded. So what we'd do is we'd go into the patrol room, stole patrol cars for training, use them for training, and when we were done, we tried to insinuate them back into the motor pool and clear off as much oil as we could without being caught. Our administration was basically working against us. And so the clue was, if you wanted to use it for training, clean off the car. We still survived. We still persevered. But it wasn't until 1998 that my department killed an officer in a vehicle accident that didn't have to happen. The difference was the lawsuit that stemmed from the inmates traveling in the back of the transport van that was involved. Dollars lost plus deputy killed equals a revisit of training. So I left homicide in order to get into the ground floor of what I considered to be the grandest opening in my professional life. I was given the opportunity to design an entirely new and critical training program for the entire department from scratch, submit it to post for approval, and then have it used as a base for 2 other agencies. Because all agencies... we moved on to the abandoned SAC alert pad at Mather Air Force Base. That was a bit of irony, considering my father's raising. And we had to literally build everything to start this track. Now, I can't hammer a nail. We had to actually build a classroom. I can't hammer a nail, so I was handed this ancient John Deere clacking tractor to mow these massive weeds in the midst of summer in Sacramento. It's 103 to 110 degrees. Again, did Mr. Stupid have a hat on his head? Hello, call for Mr. Skin Cancer, table for one, please. So that's what I did. I drove a tractor and whacked weeds. And then I had the pleasure of designing the entire program that was used for my department and 2 other departments. There's a very interesting aside, though. Because I was involved in the department's driver training issues since 1981, I found myself involved in the entire Lewis versus Sacramento County case, which involved driver training, a police pursuit, and a citizen was killed in this. You can look at the internet, Lewis v. Sacramento County, and it landed up in the U.S. Supreme Court. I'd written our department's pursuit and driving policies to date, and the Supreme Court of the United States had not found my policy wanting. Anybody else write policies that are the foundational backbone of your business or agencies and had them challenged by the U.S. Supreme Court, which resulted in your agency's complete exoneration? I did that 3 times, and I'm extremely, extremely proud of that. I continued in training. I continued to make ethical stands where I could. They continued to get me into hot water. It was only later, when I was range master for the department, that real honest-to-goodness power, capital P, came to slap me upside my head and my big mouth, which of course has always gotten me into quite a bit of trouble. When a certain individual 3 ranks above me demanded that I give a student in the academy, a female student by the way, that's not a shock, one with whom he'd been enjoying the insertion of tab A into slot B, shall we say, wanted to give an extra firearms instruction. I refused. Now, following that, it was made very clear to me that I should never consider taking the lieutenant's test, because even to apply was to be considered a waste of time. And I found that to be quite true. Well, I later took my stripes. In 2001, became a sergeant. Just from that was sort of an interesting story. I'm sure everyone remembers where they were on 9/11. On 9/11, I was at the graveyard. I was the graveyard supervisor for the department's entire communications and dispatch center. Someone called the S1 position. That's what I sat at as a supervisor. I never found out who, and they told me, turn on the TV, turn it on right away, and they hung up. And so there, I turned on the TV. All the TVs could be seen by the dispatchers and the call takers, and we all watched the events of that morning unfold. After having been promoted, I worked comm, patrol, evac, and was my 2,000-plus officer department's range master. Guns and cars, cars and guns, guns and cars. I worked with and supervised the 2 most risk-intensive areas in training in psychomotor skills, perishable skills, which yield the greatest amount of exposure for lawsuits and case law. But I've always said that if I died tomorrow, I'd done more things, legal and pushing the envelope, conjured and unconjured, than 99.9% of the persons on the planet. As I used to tell my trainees, if it's the most desperate and depraved incident you could possibly imagine committed by a human, it's old news. Someone perpetrated. They've already done that hundreds or perhaps thousands of years ago. Only the technology changes. The evil never changes. I also used to tell my trainees, if it is fiscally or politically expedient, I should say, you will be sacrificed. So there you have it. I spent 41 years in law enforcement. My vision spans 5 decades. I was a sheepdog then. I'm a sheepdog now. The older I get, the more irascible I become, which makes things for potential scrows who encounter me in tenuous circumstances even more fluctuous. Take that as a clue, ladies and gentlemen, who may decide to do whatever you will around me. Age, guile, and knavery beats youthful inexperience every time. A little bit of insight. I can tell you quite unequivocally why crime in certain areas and cities is rising. There are currently over 20 agencies being monitored by the feds operating under a consent decree. Law enforcement agencies nationwide are being told that they over-police. Consequently, officers are being told, they're being told to, and are pulling back from what is known as self-initiated activity. They're told they can't stop and frisk. Officers are handling the calls to which they're dispatched with professionalism, with integrity, don't get me wrong. But in terms of digging into the neighborhood or the community, they have mostly withdrawn because they've been told explicitly to do so by their administrators and or by pressure from community leaders, societal pressure, and don't get me wrong, self-interest. Crime rates and statistics are also trending up because of little follow-up by prosecution on impolitical cases. And also by recent propositions and laws that have decriminalized some acts, reduced them from felonies to misdemeanor, or in some cases, eliminated them wholesale. If you have the time, you're interested, check out AB 109, Proposition 47, Proposition 57 in California, for example. Property crimes and crimes involving drugs have skyrocketed because criminals are evil, but they're not as stupid as you think. Law enforcement officers realize that they are already targeted for ambush, injury, death. Things are to the point where they have to recognize and handle not just officer survival, but career survival. I've always said that America gets the kind of policing it deserves. The Ferguson effect does exist. It was acknowledged by the FBI. I know it exists. I still talk to many of my trainees, many of the people that I supervised, even today. This is nothing new. Cops are human. They respond to pressures and directives. They know they want to go home, safe to the families and loved ones at the end of watch. Accused of over-policing. Yes, many are saying now. Guess what? We are responding to your demands. Someone somewhere needs to put Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clark into a federal position of authority because of most administrators I've encountered, he understands law enforcement. Leftists tend to pit law enforcement versus the black communities continuously. But I have just one question throughout it all, and I'm going to end up, I suspect, offending some of you listening to me now or on the podcast later. But I ask it with the utmost sincerity, because I truly want an answer. I know what the answer is, I believe, but no one wants to ask the question. That's this. For an example, why is it then that, say, I don't know, Asians come from a significant distance into the U.S.? They don't even speak the language. Generally, they don't use whatever physical prowess they possess or may not possess to become adept at sports in large numbers. Why is it that they tend to succeed even more so than domestic American blacks in roughly the same national environment with roughly the same urban backgrounds? You know the answer. I know the answer. Mason Weaver knows the answer. If you haven't seen the interview with him and Tucker Carlson recently, that occurred yesterday, It's going to be up on my blog shortly. You really need to listen to that. He was shockingly refreshing. And so do the bulk of what I term America's poverty and racist racial pimps. So what's the problem? I submit it's the bulk of leftists in the Democrat Party. That's been the key to the greatest downfall and loss of power in the history of the once nuclear black family. Many families. Fear not. We can see the light at the end of the verbal tunnel. And we're likely to know that the headlights are not from a 42, 420,000-pound locomotive. If you take this trip with me, there are some things of which you should be cognizant. They are what I call BZ conventions. And it's perhaps time to talk about some of my conventions right now. One of them is, no one is equal until everyone is equal. The other one is, Islam is as Islam does. Or as I've written, the quote of, I against my brother, I and my brother against my cousin, I and my brother and my cousin against the tribe, I and my brother and my cousin and my tribe against the outsider. And, oh my, do we have a story to talk about in terms of Islam in the future in this show. This is not the day, but I suggest that, in the meantime, you make full readings if you want to be enlightened. One is the Hadith. The second is the Quran itself. The third is a book written by David Price Jones called The Closed Circle. And the fourth is another book by Lee Smith called The Strong Horse. If you understand those, you'll understand Islam. Come back to me and we'll speak about Islam when you have thoroughly read all four. We'll discuss it in the future. Another BZ convention that I have is what I call the reversal theory. And it considers the facts and the points of each given story. As in, what would occur had the reverse been true? This is one of my most fundamental considerations for each and every story written about life right now and the involvement with leftists. If it occurs with A, what would have happened? Well, for example, if it occurred with conservatives, what would have happened if it occurred with leftists? Then there's also what I call the criteria theory. And that's this. Never let these 6 points, never let facts, history, logic, rationality, proportion, or common sense get in the way of a good fucked up leftist decision. You'll also hear on the show, if you read the blog, you've read it, what I call the American media maggots. They're nothing more than what most other people call the mainstream media, except that I believe that my appellation is more accurate. I am a massive believer in the First Amendment. I can think of few, if any, situations requiring the suppression of any speech whatsoever. The First Amendment does not exist for pablum or soft speech, but primarily for challenging speech. I don't believe in censoring the left, just as I don't believe in censoring the right. And the Second Amendment exists in support of the First. I fervently believe that the Second Amendment has nothing, if anything, to do with the rights of hunters. Anyone making that is a specious argument. It exists solely for the average citizen to keep and bear arms when the time comes to defend oneself from an oppressive government or a national crisis. It's written in the Constitution that way. It's written in the Bill of Rights, I should say, that way. When flintlocks fired against flintlocks, there was equality. But when the government possesses fully automatic weaponry in every caliber imaginable, and holds sway over ammunition manufacturers, stocking millions of rounds in anticipation of domestic terror, taking precedent over the production of civilian rounds, then takes hold of non-military rounds on behalf of federal law enforcement agencies to the tune of 40 caliber, when DHS purchases 21.6 million rounds of small caliber ammunition in 2013, when it ultimately wishes in 2013, as it did, to purchase over 1 billion rounds, when the NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, lets out a contract for 46,000 rounds of hollow point pistol ammunition and 750 million rounds of assaulted bullets, including 357 Magnum caliber rounds that are able to penetrate walls. When the NOAA orders rounds, what are they doing? And why? Why is it here? Well, for example, let's consider the history of gun control in the United States. 1791, the Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of a people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, gains final ratification. 1837, Georgia passes a law banning handguns. The law is ruled unconstitutional and thrown out. 1865, in a reaction to emancipation, several southern states adopt black codes which, among other things, forbid black persons from possessing firearms. 1871, the National Rifle Association is organized around its primary goal of improving American civilians' marksmanship in preparation for war. 1927, Congress passes a law banning the mailing of concealable weapons. 1934, the National Firearms Act of 1934 regulates only fully automatic weapons like submachine guns. It's approved by Congress. 1938, the Federal Firearms Act of 1938 places the first limitations on selling ordinary firearms. Persons selling guns are required to obtain an FFL, that's a federal firearms license, at an annual cost of then $1, and to maintain records of the name and address of persons to whom firearms are sold. Gun sales to persons convicted of violent felonies were prohibited. That was in 1938. Skip up now to 1968. And I think we'll do that right when we come back.
Listening to the SHR Media Network.
Breaking news. According to the latest report coming out of SHR Media, a merchandise store to support both the Reaver of Common Sense and SHR Media has just been unleashed to the general public. Be forewarned that this site can be contagious and numerous items can be purchased to support the best news programming. Go to Reaver.one website and click on the store link to check out the merchandise.
Hello, I'm Matt, a student at Hillsdale College. Here is Hillsdale President Larry Arnn on the continuing relevance of the Constitution.
Many argue today that the Constitution is outdated because it addresses problems peculiar to the 18th century. Some parts of the Constitution do read rather quaintly. Consider the injunction against titles of nobility in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. But is that so outdated? The purpose of the injunction is to prevent the government granting special privileges to some for partisan reasons. This strikes at the heart of the rule of law. The crony capitalism so common today is a place where the government bestows favors and tax dollars on some businesses to give them a leg up over others. This is exactly the kind of thing the Constitution was meant to prohibit. The Constitution is not so outdated after all.
This Constitution Minute was brought to you by Hillsdale College. To join the national conversation on the Constitution, go to constitutionminute.com.
Times are dark. The people misled by corrupt politicians, lied to by establishment media, and deceived by the false messages of Islam. A nation in confusion needs a guide. It needs a man with a cane. I'm Dave Milner. Join me on Spreaker, SHR Media, High Plains Talk Radio, Live Rebooting Liberty and YouTube for a unique brand of commentary on the unpleasant blind guy. Because truth is not always pleasant.
In a world controlled by corrupt politicians.
You got a business. You didn't build that.
A team of ordinary men emerge from the ashes to give voice to the voiceless and hope to the hopeless. Sackhead Sean.
Dude, I'm not saying half of the stupid brother.
Sackhead Clint.
All good friends of ours usually show up drunk.
Also starring Sacco as the producer.
I'm a little bit drunk, cause I'm drinking.
They are the Sackheads Radio Show. Every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Pacific on SHRmedia.com.
Beware, the Jersey Takeover is here. Every Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can catch the Reverb Common Sense Show, hosted by Jersey Joe, right here on SHRmedia.com and HighPlainsDailyNews.com. Only Jersey can deliver hell like no one else, so consider this your fair warning.
Conservative media done right. You're listening to the SHR Media Network.
Then there was 1968, and listen to how frequently things happen now. The Gun Control Act of 1968 was enacted for the purpose of keeping firearms out of the hands of those not legally entitled to possess them. The BATF is created in 1972. In 1977, D.C. enacts anti-handgun laws, which requires registration. 86, the Armed Career Profile Act, the Firearms Owner Protection Act, the Law Enforcement Officers Protection Act. 1989, California bans the possession of semi-automatic assault weapons following a shooting in Stockton. 1990, and it continues, 1990, 1994, 1997. Then it moves geometrically. 1998 in June, Justice Department report indicates the blocking of some 68,000 handguns for sale during 1977, while the Brady Bill pre-sale background checks were required. 1998, July, October, November, Chicago files a $433 million suit against local gun dealers and makers, alleging their oversupplying of local markets and providing guns to criminals. All through 98, many more suits occur. 99, more suits occur. May 20th, 1999, in a 51-50 vote, with the tiebreaker vote cast by Vice President Gore, the Senate passes a bill requiring trigger locks on all newly manufactured firearms. The bills just keep coming, and this is planned. This is purposeful. We all recognize and realize criminals couldn't care less. So these detailed and obfuscating laws penalize only the good and unfetter the bad. I've already been listed as a domestic terrorist by my federal government in Janet Napolitano's DHS because I was a liberty lover. A report was actually issued entitled Hotspots of Terrorism and Other Crimes in the United States, 1970 to 2008, produced by the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism at the University of Maryland. The organization was launched with the aid of DHS funding to the tune of $12 million, your taxpayer-funded dollars, your gun-owning taxpayer-funded dollars. While largely omitting Islamic terrorism, the report completely fails to mention the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. The study focuses on Americans who hold beliefs shared by the vast majority of conservatives and libertarians and puts them in the context of radical extremism. What's radical extremism? The report takes its definition from a 2011 study entitled Profiles of Perpetrators of Terrorism, produced by the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism, in which the following characteristics are used to identify terrorists. Americans who believe their way of life may be under attack. Americans who are fiercely nationalistic, as opposed to universal and international in orientation. People who consider themselves anti-global and are concerned about the loss of American seniority. Americans who are suspicious of centralized federal authority. Americans who are reverent of individual liberty. People who believe in conspiracy theories that involve grave threat to national sovereignty and personal liberty. Like a lot of people that I know and understand. So, that was our country under Barack Hussein Obama, and how short a memory we possess. Also, the focus on ammunition. The last U.S. lead smelter, major smelter, closed its operations in 2013. The lead smelter, located in Herculaneum, Missouri, and owned and operated by the Doe Run Company, existed right there at that location since 1892. The Herculaneum smelter was the only smelter in the United States which could produce lead bullion from raw lead coal, and is mined nearby in Missouri's extensive lead deposits. And I wonder who closed them down. It was the EPA who closed them down. How remarkably convenient is that? Let's not forget that the Bank of America in 2013 began to deny the purchase of ammunition on credit. The federal government wanted, but the state of California is soon to acquire a complete background check for every purchase of ammunition, as deep and intense as if you were purchasing the firearm itself. That's here in California. That's law. In other words, if you wish to purchase ammunition in the state of California, you must submit to the same background check as if you were purchasing a handgun. There's also California's current law which mandates that you must turn in your semi-automatic magazines larger than 10 rounds. And you heard about the background check for ammunition. I think you're starting to see some linkage here. So I've set some background. And now we're going to talk about our outgoing president, Barack Hussein Obama. And he'll be leaving in 3 days. A man who stated in 2008 that he would fundamentally change America. I submit that he achieved that goal on every level. I submit that his chief contribution to change was that of division. As the divider-in-chief, Obama's entire agenda revolved around striating people by class, sex, race, religion, earnings, region, state, city, county, clothing, music, laws, wages, healthcare, culture, employment, family, mode of transport, energy consumption, food, the cable channels you watched, media consumed, social settings, the way you view America, even your writings, your statements, and thoughts. Identity politics. He believes in income redistribution, and to his massive glee, regulation skyrocketed. Faceless and unelected bureaucrats created, in truth, more rules than did Congress. taxes went up, welfare went up, more persons were on food stamps than in the history of the country before, and the economy dumped. In not one of his years did the GDP, the gross domestic product, even come close to a standard 3%. That's a situation unseen since Herbert Hoover in the 1930s. Obama, you see, worries about his legacy. His view of his legacy differs greatly from the truth. The truth is that he hasn't improved the social or economic standards for the bulk of poor and minority Americans. There are more poor persons in the U.S. than when he began his first term. Specifically, black home ownership is down. Racial division is up. Now, what I'm about to say is shocking in any fashion by any stretch of the imagination. The key to success is to keep families intact. And as I mentioned earlier, that's one thing that is hurting Black America. I mentioned Asians. If you're looking for a difference, there's one massive, massive point. The key to success, any young people who happen to be listening, no matter your color, the key to success is this. Number one, graduate from high school. Number two, don't have a child before wedlock. Number three, make good life choices. Stop. Making good life choices is deemed harsh and judgmental by leftists across the nation, thereby eliminating a full one-third of the success theorem. Leftists think you need to be free to pillage when you feel wounded or unquiet, riot when offended, destroy property when the unfairness fairy has come to visit. And I have not even addressed Obamacare because, after all, where would you begin? Once Roberts confirmed Obamacare, the smug factor was plastered on Mr. Obama's face 24/7. We both know it. Then there's the Obama doctrine. Every president has a doctrine, roughly, which reflects his thoughts and opinions. Mr. Obama's doctrine, and he was ever so proud of this phrase, is to lead from behind. Any fifth grader can recognize the inherent stupidity of that phrase itself. Yet, Obama made friends with our enemies and enemies out of our friends. Moving all U.S. troops from Iraq was the recipe for ISIS, whom Obama quantified as the JV team. For people that don't know what that means, that's junior varsity. Instead of the varsity team, he wasn't taking them seriously. In Syria, Assad poisoned his people after Obama drew his red line in the sand. Obama's response was nothing. It is an axiom, a clear axiom. I've written this many times. In politics, you meet words with words and actions with actions. So the opportunity passed. We had the Arab Spring. We had the Russian reset. And now, Germany and all of Europe have Mr. Obama to thank for the horrors resulting in Syria. That has also led to the drastic increase in Muslim unrest, crime, and terrorism across the entire EU. And death followed Angela Merkel. In terms of Russia, it was Obama who appeased Russia with his reset Hillary Clinton handing a red reset button with the wrong words on top of the thing to a Russian ambassador, and Obama's Satovoichi placating of Medvedev in terms of being more flexible to Russia when he achieved his second term. Putin invaded countries at will, continued digital hacking. China built their own island, for God's sakes, in the middle of the South China Sea and claimed it in the country's name, nothing more than a naked power extension. Those were international waters, but Mr. Obama would rather worry about transgender bathrooms and putting turbans on bearded soldiers in America. Then there's Iran. Obama has bent over, I should change that, he's been bent over by Iran, literally shipping them physical pallets of cash in the dead of night as if from some lurid Tom Clancy novel. Just as Obama leads from the rear, he also negotiates from the rear, ensuring that the U.S. gains nothing in negotiations and gives away everything. Iran will still get nukes. Iran has clearly violated the agreement. Obama was not negotiating with the moderates. There is no such animal in the upper echelons of Iran. It doesn't exist. They said they were going to do so all along. And they've used the cash that Obama freed up to the tunes of billions of dollars to continue their sponsorship of terror around the world. Obama, having determined that income redistribution is good at home, it's a great thing, brought that point to the rest of the globe by stating that so-called global warming is more critical than worldwide Muslim terror. Look, climate change is occurring. It has always occurred, and it will always occur. I submit that you cannot unequivocally state climate change is completely anthropogenic because, one, we have no long-term statistics. And I don't mean for the past 200 years. That's nothing in terms of climate prediction or statistics. And two, scientists are divided widely, not on global change, climate change, I should say, but they vary widely on anthropogenic global or climate change. That is to say, what percentile is from man and what percentile is natural. The damnable thing is that Mr. Obama imposed draconian measures and regulations on America. Smashed businesses, redistributed more wealth, shut down entire industries, somehow thinking that bad air from China and India would somehow respect our national borders. How daft is that? So what's Obama's legacy? The American voters consistently rejected the stance of the Democrats, including Mr. Obama, for the past 8 years, and they lost 63 seats in the House, 10 seats in the Senate. Republicans gained 900-plus seats in state legislatures, along with 12 governorships across the U.S., meaning that two-thirds of the governors in the nation are now Republican. And then there were all the Russian hacks that occurred under Mr. Obama's term. 2009, the electric grid. 2009, the Pentagon's U.S. Joint Strike Fighter pilot. 2012, the NSA was hacked. 2013, Department of Energy. 2013, the FEC. 2014, U.S. Postal Service. 2014, NOAA. We talked about them before. 2014, the White House was hacked. 2015, the State Department. 2015, the Department of Defense. 2015, the Internal Revenue Service. June of 2015, the Office of Personnel Management, where the greatest theft of sensitive personnel data in history occurred. 21.5 million persons' information was compromised. Only when the arcs of Obama's good friends got gored did Russia even remotely become a blip on his radar. We could go into WikiLeaks. We could go into all sorts of things. Some of those points were Via WikiLeaks, we heard that Donna Brazil leaked a CNN delegate question to the HRC campaign. She pushed back at CNN coverage of the Clinton campaign. Journalists who covered Clinton were invited to her campaign manager's house. Katie Couric offered to showcase Clinton's personality in a personal gushing interview with her. Politico, now New York Times journalist Glenn Thrush, sent a story to the Clinton campaign for approval. Huffington Post writer said the HuffPo wanted to make sure Clinton is elected. They came out and said it. CNBC's John Harwood worried he offended Podesta about a story about Clinton. He mocked reporters who asked Clinton tough questions. He emailed Podesta about questions that he should ask Jeb Bush. John Harwood tried to have lunch with Podesta. CNN tipped off the Clinton campaign about favorable poll findings. Reuters offered to share the House Benghazi Committee intel with the campaign. Politico offered the Clinton campaign a chance to edit a story. New York Times allowed a Clinton campaign veto power on a story and edits. The Boston Globe pumped up the Clinton campaign. Univision chairman pressured Clinton campaign to attack Trump. MSNBC producers praised Hillary Clinton. Clinton's campaign openly bragged about support from the U.S. media. Clinton staff colludes with NBC on the interview about the Clinton Foundation. That's just a sampling. Up to this point, Obama's had the grim determination of an asthmatic chihuahua regarding foreign hacking. You and I know it's the truth. Instead of embracing organization, structure, discipline, Obama has condoned and even fostered chaos. He is the most comfortable when he's ramming bills like the ACA down the throats of Congress. Then, when he's perceived he's going to be opposed, creates more EOs, executive orders, that contain the words must and shall than any prior president. With a phone and a pen, he's demolished the legislative and judicial branches of government and truly deserved the label of imperial president. All of this comes with a massive caveat that he and the Democrats apparently did not recognize for whatever ignorant reason. Clue. What can be done with a phone and a pen can be undone with a phone and a pen. When you bypass Congress, expect your successor will do the exact same thing and walk through the very door that you opened. Here's the crazy Jekyll and Hyde of it all with Americans. People still like Obama personally. He still enjoys high approval ratings. Right now, they hate his politics. They've made that abundantly clear. A consistency is that he's been tone deaf. That's his legacy. His refusal to work across the aisle. That's his legacy. Bipartisanship and compromise, when it occurred, had to happen on the side of the Republicans. People always spoke about the inflexibility of Bush and his unwillingness to admit he'd even made mistakes, but the same is true about Obama. His thought was, if only people would recognize my intrinsic brilliance, things would be so much better. It comes off as haughty, elitist arrogance, which it is. His overall Mayan has been that of conceit, pride, self-centeredness, and a punitive sense of America. Obama believes it's incumbent upon him to ensure the country atoned for what he thought due to his upbringing and his leftist education. America's terrible colonialism and oppression. It was his job, he believed, to minimize America's power. A country he believes is too big for its damn britches. Well, in terms of those goals, Obama was more successful than he could even imagine. So what's our future? We're a nation of laws. How long we will continue to be a nation of laws living under the rule of law when it is precisely this concept that is being threatened, not only from without, but within. How long will the left continue to push unabated without some form of resulting pushback occurring? I write on my blog that I am pushback. I do that because I see myself as one form of antidote to the terrible and corruptive forces that are presently at work in this nation. My form of pushback is written and verbal. Like I said, the axiom is match words with words and actions with actions. President John Kennedy said in 1962 that those who make peaceful evolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. Those are called clues. There is an odd dichotomy at work here. Islam is becoming less a religion, as I indicated. It's more of a social, culture, and political system and ideology. Simultaneously, leftists are leaving secularism as we normally view it and becoming more religious themselves. I call them the religious left because, at first blush, global warming, for example. Nothing is etched in stone scientifically in terms of anthropogenic global warming, yet any non-belief in that is to be destroyed and eliminated. It's the same with their other major bullet point beliefs. If you are not in congruent thinking, writing, and speaking with leftists, you are a heretic, an apostate, and you must be assassinated at every turn. You must not be allowed to craft opposing views, and instead your freedoms must be removed. In that way, leftists are akin to the Borg and to Islam. Assimilate or be demolished. It's a slash and burn, go nowhere philosophy. So, we are soon to be on a journey together, you and I. You, right now, you're going to have to determine whether I'm worth listening to, worth spending your quite valuable time with. So I've made this explanation tonight so that you have a better idea of who I am, where I've been, what I've done, what I've seen, things that have moved and placed me to where I am today. Make no mistake, I have no interest in being gracious. I have no interest in equanimity, in bipartisanship, or the slightest bit of compromise. I've been on this planet a sufficient time to realize just where compromise has gotten us as a nation, a people, and a culture. On the brink, the chasm of a yawning void right below us. I say to leftists, watch out. You might get what you're after. So, we're on a journey, you and I. Every good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. This story is just beginning. And I'll say this only once. I just like the accent. The Bloviating Zeppelin.